Hi, I'm Logan. Today I'll be presenting our Chi 2024 paper, If This Person is Suicidal, What Do I Do? Designing computational approaches to help online volunteers respond to suicidality. As a warning, throughout this work, I'm going to be talking a lot about suicidality, pretty frequently and explicitly, including specifics like methods or planning. Suicidality is a widespread experience. The CDC estimates that each year about 12 million US adults seriously considered suicide, and about 50,000 died by it. Many people go online for suicidality support to search engines like Google or social media like Reddit or Instagram or peer support platforms like Seven Cups or Talk Life. Prior work on HCI and suicidality has focused either on people who seek support for suicidality online or on creating technologies to automate suicide prevention care like therapy chatbots or suicide prediction models. But little prior work has focused on the people who currently provide support for suicidality online and how we can design these technologies not only to replace those people, but to help them in their work. To fill this gap, we interviewed volunteer counselors on a peer support website about their experiences responding to suicidality. So first we'll go over some background on our site, and then we'll go over methods and findings for our two-part study, where in part one of the study, we interviewed volunteers to understand their perspectives, needs, and challenges responding to suicidality. And then in part two, we use a method called speed dating to see how to design online platforms and technologies to better help these volunteers respond to suicidal people online. And lastly, we'll go over some implications. So we conducted this study with volunteers on a peer-to-peer mental health support website where untrained volunteers get randomly matched with support seekers, and they have one-on-one text-based conversations about not just suicide, but really like anything from breakups to bipolar disorder, etc. And actually the site prohibits suicidal talk. So if someone mentions suicide, including passive suicidal ideation, volunteers are instructed to immediately end the chat and send the suicide hotline link instead. These kinds of restrictions on suicidal talk are very common online. For example, most social media platforms and search engines restrict most content about suicide. However, we speculate and later find that suicidal people still come to these sites for support despite these restrictions. In the first part of the study, we interviewed volunteers about suicidality on the site, again, mainly their perspectives, current approaches, needs, and challenges responding to people who experience suicidality. And then we also had mock chats where I role-played someone experiencing one of 5 severities of suicidality, from passive suicidal ideation to active suicidal attempts, to see how participants would respond to these various kinds of suicidality. I'll talk a little more about our methods for part 2 of the study after we talk about participant demographics and findings for part 1. Volunteers weren't trained on suicidality by the site, but 3 of our 11 participants had some formal training on suicide prevention beforehand. About half had personal experience with suicide, either experiencing it themselves or a significant experience with a loved one's suicidality. All 11 participants said that they had chatted with someone who was suicidal on the site, however. But also, most of our participants were more experienced and active than the average volunteer on the site. For example, many participants had been volunteering for years and were in more involved roles like leadership positions at the site. And demographically, most of our participants were from the US or India, which is where most of the site's support seekers come from, and most were also white and South Asian. Now, for findings, despite the site's prohibitions on suicidal talk, all participants said that they had chatted with suicidal people on the site. Many said this was a regular occurrence that left volunteers feeling unprepared and confused. For example, one participant said, "I'm in a volunteer support chat room for about 2 hours a day, and at least 10 to 15 questions are about like, oh, if this person is suicidal, what do I do? Like, why was this not part of your training?" Yet, despite feeling unprepared, participants could actually identify suicidality accurately in our mock chats, as shown in the figure on the right, where participants' judgments of the severity of each mock chat almost matches the intended severity that we wrote the mock chat to be. That being said, participants said that identifying when someone was suicidal in real chats on the site was more difficult and stressful than it was in mock chats because people often hid their suicidality or used vague language to intentionally evade the site's restrictions on suicidal talk. In mock chats, most participants continued offering support for suicidality despite knowing that the site policy instructs them to end the chat immediately when someone mentions suicide. Participants did this because suicidal support seekers that they've talked to have described the site like a last resort, a place that people can go to when they don't feel safe to go to other resources like hotlines or family members. And participants didn't want to just abandon suicidal support seekers by ending the conversation with them. However, without any help from the site beyond this guidance to immediately end the chat, participants were left feeling personally responsible for the well-being of suicidal support seekers, and participants took on a lot of emotional burdens as a result. For example, when describing the site's guidance to end chats with suicidal people, one participant said, "You're shooing people away or like they don't matter when this is the one time that you really need to be there for them. Then they leave and they don't connect to any crisis hotline, and then you don't know what's happening. Like it's bad. Like it's weird thinking about it. Like it makes me really sad." Based on participants' expressed wants and needs from the first set of interviews, we identified 4 areas for design opportunities in the second set of interviews. First, online volunteers should get more training on how to identify and respond to suicidality on the site. Second, volunteers should get more emotional preparation for chats about suicide, as well as emotional support after the fact. Third, participants wanted more real-time task support to help decide what to do when responding to a suicidal support seeker. And finally, participants wanted more help identifying suicidality, if nothing else to help boost their confidence and relieve stress. In the second part of our study, we used speed dating, a design method where we quickly show participants up to 18 design concepts and get their immediate feedback on them. We generated the design concepts based on the 4 areas of design opportunities identified in part 1 of the study, and many of our design concepts incorporate some technology proposed for suicide prevention in prior work as a way to evaluate if these technologies can actually help people who currently provide suicidality support online. We especially focus on suicide prediction models and conversational agents for delivering therapy. For the first set of design concepts, we presented 2 design concepts around volunteer training on suicidality. For the first concept, we suggested using a conversational agent to simulate a suicidal support seeker, which the site could use to automate mock chats like the ones that we did in this study for training purposes. And second, we suggested using a technology to flag suicidal chats so that moderators could evaluate those chats and better identify who needs training for suicidality support. Participants really liked the first concept because they said volunteers currently learn how to respond to suicidality through actual conversations with suicidal support seekers on the site, which puts suicidal support seekers at risk of harmful conversations with unprepared volunteers. But having a chatbot that can emulate someone experiencing suicidality could give participants exposure to suicidal chats without having to practice on real people. Participants didn't really see a need for the second concept because they thought that all volunteers needed significantly more training on suicidality, not just the ones that moderators selected. We presented 6 design concepts around emotional preparation and support, 2 highlighted here. First, we suggested automatically connecting volunteers to emotional support immediately after conversations about suicide. And second, we suggested notifying volunteers whether a support seeker they're about to talk with has talked about suicidality on the platform before so that volunteers can prepare for a potentially difficult conversation or decline the chat entirely. Overall, participants like concepts around emotional preparation and support the most out of the 4 design areas that we identified because the site currently offers some resources for emotional support, like peer support for volunteers, but these resources are often hard to access or unknown to new volunteers. So participants like the first design concept, which would make these existing resources more accessible. However, they didn't like the second concept because they worried that labeling someone as suicidal could prejudice volunteers. So instead, participants wanted more general emotional preparation, like experiential training. For those who had already seen the training chatbot idea that we introduced in the previous slide, they said that this would be a really helpful for emotional preparation as well. We presented 2 design concepts around real-time task support. First, we suggested using a language model to give volunteers suggestions on how to respond in chats about suicide. Second, we suggested having additional support staff available on the site who are specifically trained around suicidality so that volunteers can call them into the chat whenever they need it. Participants didn't like the first concept because they worried that automated suggestions would make people sound more robotic and less empathetic, which aligns with recent work that's tried to use large language models like ChatGPT to automate therapy, but has found that people really don't like it because it feels like simulated empathy or it feels like weird and empty. However, participants really liked the idea of trained support staff because they felt abandoned by the site currently. So this could be a way for them to offload some of the responsibility of supporting suicidal people on the site. We had 7 design concepts that were all variations of using a suicide prediction model that uses real-time chat data to detect when a conversation is about suicidality. We had a lot of concepts for this because suicide prediction models are really prominent in prior work, but most of our participants didn't like this technology because they worried that it would be used to, as one participant put it, help the site in enforcing their policy as like a mass moderation tool to automatically end suicidal chats or maybe even ban volunteers who offer support to suicidal people. That being said, a few participants actually liked automatically ending chats because they thought that having untrained volunteers try to offer suicide support was dangerous to the support seeker. Now, some overall implications of our work. First, we argue that online sites offer a particularly important space for supporting people who experience suicidality because online spaces offer an alternative to medical services like hotlines, therapists, or hospitals. Our participants said that people often go online to the site because they don't have access to these kinds of services, or they specifically want to avoid these services, oftentimes to avoid potential police involvement, unintended family conflict, or non-consensual active rescue. Therefore, we argue that platforms should loosen restrictions on talking about suicide to allow for more safe spaces and more robust systems of care where people can talk more openly about suicidality online. And second, we argue that HCI and computational fields should focus more on understanding and designing for the online communities and people who currently provide suicidality support, rather than on designing technologies to automate this kind of suicide prevention work that they do, or mass moderation of these online communities. Furthermore, we argue that AI like suicide prediction models and language models for real-time response suggestions may be ill-suited for online volunteers due to concerns about harming suicidal support seekers by encouraging robotic or potentially dangerous responses, or by restricting volunteers' autonomy by using predictive models to moderate or forcibly end conversations about suicide. Finally, a number of researchers and media outlets have recently suggested using ChatGPT or conversational agents to replace your therapist, like the Time magazine article says on the right. We argue that using AI to automate mental health care, especially suicide prevention work, can be really dangerous and unethical. Rather, conversational agents may be better suited for improving training of mental health care providers. For example, our participants love the idea of using a chatbot to simulate conversations with suicidal people because that would allow volunteers to really learn how to have these kinds of conversations without having to practice on real people who are in distress. Finally, I want to acknowledge all my co-authors. I'm Logan, but this work was done in collaboration with Sunniva Liu, Cindy Liu, Irene Hong, Stevie Chancellor, Robert Kraut, and Haiyi. And lastly, thank you to all of our participants, and thank you for listening. If you'd like to learn more, please read the full paper. It's listed there. Again, it's If This Person is Suicidal, What Do I Do? Designing Computational Approaches to Help Online Volunteers Respond to Suicidality. I'm also super happy to chat about the paper or anything else, so please email me, or you can find me on my website. Both are listed at the bottom. Thank you.